Well, good evening to all you crazy, wonderful people, and welcome to my May installment of Caleb's Corner. It's been a while since I've done just a normal Caleb's Corner. Um, Lots of things have been happening in my life. I've been quite busy. Started a new job. I'm still teaching at night and working on something new for Caleb's Corner. Hopefully I'll be able to do this June. It'll be something a little bit different, a little more specialized, if you will. I'll have a guest co-host, I almost said cohort there, a guest co-host for what I'm planning. We'll have to see how that pans out. So stick around. I don't want to spoil any of the fun, but anyway, let's see where it goes from there. Tonight, I'm going to actually give you a presentation with some slides that I made, and I'm going to touch on a very hot button topic right now, and that is the wokeness that is infecting Protestant churches today. If you've looked around the internet, if you're familiar with some of the prominent Protestant resources out there, like the Gospel Coalition, or if you're familiar with guys like Tim Keller and Matt Chandler and John Piper and others like that, Russell Moore would be another one, who are in the Protestant world who've really bought into this woke Christianity. It's well, I don't want to spoil really anything. You know what I'm talking about if you're familiar with those people. When I was still a Protestant, which was only about, it was about 2014. So that was, well, no, I'm converting to Orthodoxy now, as I said before. I'm a catechumen. But in 2014, I was still a Protestant. When my wife and I married, we were also still Protestant. And during that time, we were attending my wife's church in Tomball. We were house sitting for my in-laws. And this is when a lot of that woke business started to come out, this real emphasis on race relations within evangelical Christianity, and a majorly passing of the blame for the segregation of the evangelical churches on to mainly white people. And the thing is that at first it was really subtle, but then it became louder and louder and louder. I still remember it as clear as day when I was in my wife's church, old church at the time, and her pastor got up on the pulpit and he was basically railing against something, I won't say what, that white people have done. And he would always say how much he hates racism because he's half Mexican, which I'm like, okay, the guy was as white as I am. Maybe he was half Mexican, I don't know. But the point is he would always make that a point when he would talk about this subject. And if you ever went onto like his Facebook page or his, or any of his social media, it was really, really in your face about what he was talking about. But this wokeism stuff is basically just recycled cultural Marxism. That's exactly what it is. It is taking a very secularist, anti-Christian worldview, and attempting to baptize it in order to make it look, sound, and smell Christian. And at first, when I was a Protestant, I was just really oh, this is disgusting. I want nothing to do with this. People are really, doing a witch hunt here. There's nothing wrong with these churches, things like that. And one of the reasons I was so vocally against it is that at the time I was in master's school getting my master's in English literature, and I was taking a course called Critical Race Theory in Rousseau, which was all about reading the philosophy and works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau through the lens of critical race theory, which again is a Marxist idea. This Marxism, of course, is basically the backbone of communism, which was invented by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, of course, said that basically there is this forever struggle between the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the bourgeoisie is constantly suppressing the proletariat. It's making them serve their purposes. So what the proletariat needs to do is to rise up and fight against and overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish them as the new order. Well, the thing is, this gave birth to communism, of course, and which is, of course, Karl Marx's book, The Communist Manifesto, was based on. And of course, this is where we got Mao's China. This is where we got Red Russia. This is where we've got Pol Pot, Vietnam, North Korea, you name it, all this communist stuff was birthed out of Karl Marx's thoughts. Well, the thing is, the world, at least for the time, seemed to have learned its lesson and realized, yeah, this isn't really working politically. So some of our, as Father Stephen de Young would say, our 19th century German friends sort of readopted Marxism and began to apply it to sociology as well as anthropology, and began saying, well, there are certain people in society that are minorities, that's racial minorities, that's, class minorities, and then later became sexual minorities, all those kind of things. And they applied cultural Marxism to that, and it has now become extremely popular. I'm really shorting this just to save for time, but basically this began to inundate our education, inundate our colleges, inundate all kinds of things, and eventually it made its way to the churches. Now that I am an Orthodox Christian, and I'm on my way to being received into the Orthodox Church, I could honestly care less what evangelical Protestants do with their churches, because I believe that the Orthodox Church is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. However, this wokeness is finding its way into apostolic churches. It's finding its way into Catholicism. It's finding its way into Orthodoxy. There are some Orthodox dioceses, which I will not name because I don't want to give them any press time whatsoever, that have adopted a very woke stance on racial issues and things of that nature. And in all honesty, it's quite disgusting. But since coming to Orthodoxy, I've sort of reevaluated what could have possibly caused this woke business to emerge in evangelical and Protestant churches. And now that I've had a chance to reevaluate that and come from a different place, I've really come to a very different and more nuanced conclusion than I had before. And this is the little slide I have prepared for you this night. So this is not only my point of view as to why this woke crap has invaded the Reformed evangelical world and Reformed Protestant world, but also what caused it and why the reaction is the way it is from both sides of the aisle within the Reformed world, and what our response should be as Orthodox Christians. So let me share my screen real quick. Give me just a second. Always like those visual aids. So let me start from this. We're going to start a slideshow. Okay. So what you're seeing here is an icon of the Orthodox Church, and these are the apostles and the fathers in the ship, and this ship is supposed to be the Holy Orthodox Church, which you can see my mouse cursor there. It says Holy Orthodox Church. There's the Theotokos, there's the apostles, and there's the Holy Fathers of the Church, Augustine, Irenaeus, all those. And down here you see all these figures throughout history. Julian the Apostate, the emperor who abandoned Christianity, become a pagan. You see persecuting emperors. You see the dragon, which is of course the devil. You see heretics like this patriarch over here. You see demons. You see the Muslims over here. And you even see Martin Luther down here. And what this is trying to convey is that throughout the centuries, there's been many things that have tried to tear the church apart and tried to sink the ship that is the church, but nothing has been able to do so. That's been our confession in the Orthodox Church, is that you can be born outside the church, you can leave the church, you can never tear the church apart. The oneness of the church, both spiritually and physically, can never be broken. So this is going to sort of frame, just to sort of give you the framework of my mind approaching this whole issue. But I'm calling this little talk here on Caleb's Corner Reformed Cognitive Dissonance, and how 500 years of heresy segregated Protestantism. So, as I mentioned earlier in sort of my prelude to this presentation, there is a growing acceptance of critical race theory. I mean, it's reaching a point to where so many influential leaders in the Reformed, mainly Reformed Protestant world, are just accepting it wholesale. I'm showing a handful of some of the most prominent leaders who are accepting critical race theory. This would include Tim Keller, Ligon Duncan, Thabiti Anyabwile, Matt Chandler, Russell Moore, Al Mohler, and John Piper. These are well-known figures in the sort of evangelical Reformed movement, meaning these guys are all Calvinists, but they're not necessarily Reformed in that they hold to a Reformed confession like the Westminster Confession of Faith or the what's the other one? London Baptist Confession of 1689. For example, Matt Chandler is very much a charismatic Calvinist, as is John Piper. Tim Keller is sort of the golden boy of the Presbyterian Church in America, but it just seems like every year he just becomes more liberal, and he fits in with this crowd. These guys, if you go visit their blogs, if you go see what they've said on the Gospel Coalition concerning race, it's very much this, like I said, cultural Marxist way of dealing with it. And this is the idea that white Christians are to blame for why our Black brothers and sisters do not come to our churches. And because of that, we need to accept responsibility. What they mean really is white guilt about that. And we need to create a space for them to interact and join our churches, things of that nature. And while I'm always, of course, I'm totally for black, white, red, yellow, whatever, to join in the bonds of brotherly love under the banner of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. But what I do not like about this is that this sort of blame that they're placing onto white Christians is the same narrative we're hearing from the far socio-political left in America that says, oh, if you're white, you're part of the problem. Well, here's the thing. And the other thing is that you have like guys like Chandler. It's like, oh, we're not equipped to deal with this, so we need to let the experts handle it, meaning secularists, by the way. That sort of thinking is just simply not Christian. The idea of blaming or ascribing guilt to someone because of the color of their skin it's simply racist, whether you're black or white or whatever color, assigning it to someone else. I mean, saying that I'm guilty because of the pigment of my skin, it is quite frankly just ridiculous. Ligon Duncan even said in one of a clip I had heard him talking about that said we, he said, I have black friends who say they're afraid to come to church with white people because of Donald Trump being in office and things like that. It's like, what? Like, tell me how that's not racist. But it's just like, it gets these oohs and ahs of sadness. Oh, what can we do about this? And of course, with the various, shootings of black men in America and deaths of black men in America at the hands of police, this has only exacerbated the problem. So, but you have this wholesale, Matt Chandler, of course, He had, I don't know if you've ever seen it or whatever, but one of the former members of his church, who happened to be a cop, wrote about an interaction he had with Matt Chandler, where he called him out for like basically slamming the police from the pulpit, and he's like, "Well, I'm only going by what my black friend says in his experience," and it was quite. He was pretty much ignored the whole time about like, "Hey, man, you need to pull the reins up on this. This isn't fair to do this to cops." But the whole point of this is sort of showing you where these ideas are just growing. And this is, of course, when you had the Gospel Coalition come out swinging against Donald Trump. I mean, Russell Moore wrote some pretty, I won't say vitriolic, but pretty, I mean, critical is a nice way of putting it, but just nasty opinion pieces about lambasting Donald Trump. Yet these same people that you see listed here in the Gospel Coalition when Obama was in the office would say, "Oh, just pray for Obama," and things like that. But when Trump comes out, "Oh, he's awful, he's a reprobate," and blah, 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 blah. And I'm not making this about politics. I'm just saying it's interesting to see how their behavior plays out and how they're really catering to one side of the socio-political spectrum and not another. It's like if you're to the right of the political spectrum, it's like, well, you're part of the problem. You need to fix it. You need to say you're sorry. Whereas on the left, there's absolutely nothing. There's no sort of guilt ascribed to them, despite the fact that the left has consistently been a proponent of killing the unborn in the womb via abortion, and also a proponent of gay marriage, all those kind of things. It's just an interesting way that they've treated this. But anyway, quite telling. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have the opponents of critical race theory. And these would be guys like Doug Wilson, Jeff Durbin of Apologia Church, James White, also of Apologia Church, Vodi Bakum, and John MacArthur. I have John MacArthur. I almost did something on John MacArthur, but maybe I'll have to do that for another Caleb's Corner if you've been following the sex scandal that's been coming out of his church. But anyway, when I was in the Reformed world, these were kind of guys I clung to because they were the voices that were standing up against this critical race theory nonsense that was coming into the church. But when I exited out of the Reformed world to Anglicanism, which I didn't stay in long, thank God, and then to Holy Orthodoxy, I began to look back on this. And I'm really summarizing here, but most of these folks that you see here who are the opponents of critical race theory being introduced into the American evangelicalism and Reformed Protestantism, their reaction is sort of like, especially from guys like John MacArthur, well, and all of them really, is that, well, there's really nothing wrong. They're just adopting the narrative, the zeitgeist of the world, and they're just trying to stir the pot. Our churches are fine. There's nothing wrong with them at all. I'm like, now that like I said, that I've exited that world, I've had to reevaluate that because that was my kind of default setting. But after reevaluating it, of course, I'm no longer Reformed. I'm no longer a Calvinist, but I actually believe that the opponents of critical race theory within the Reformed evangelical circles are also wrong. And here's why. Yes, I know. Yes, I can hear your hate mail coming right now. But essentially, the Gospel Coalition, this is what their logo really should look like, is basically baptizing an inherently Marxist and anti-Christian ideology, which separates Christians and treats Christians according to the color of their skin. This is where you get things like white privilege being and white guilt being introduced into the mix. But you often hear some of those fellas who are proponents of critical race theory talk about how the Protestant church is collectively guilty of racism, right? Other issues are now being questioned, and this is coming out. Some of this coming out of the SBC, questions about reevaluating women's ordinations, sexual ethics. You often have some of these churches saying that, well, you know, being gay isn't sinful, just engaging in homosexual sex is sinful. And that's never been the position of the church anywhere in 2,000 years. But in recent news, I saw this tweet by a Dr. Charles W. McKinney Jr., who is a college professor. I won't say at what college, but as far as I can tell, I don't believe he's a Christian of any kind, but he posted this tweet that says, I'm a devout believer in a religion that holds me accountable for the sins of Adam. Also critical race theory is evil because it tells us actions in the past have consequences in the present. And what he's getting at there, go to the next slide, is the Protestant understanding of original sin, which is a heretical one. Now, if you watch my Caleb's Corner, I used the same slide and talked about the Orthodox understanding of ancestral sin, which is the term we use to distinguish between what original sin has come to mean in the Western Church. But like I said, the Catholic and the Orthodox understanding of original or ancestral sin is actually quite close, though there are some differences. But the Protestant understanding of original sin is just downright heretical. And because the logic here, before we get to the logic, but the way Protestants understand original sin is not only are you stained by the sin of Adam and Eve, and not only are you contaminated by the evil and the sin that has been unleashed in this world, like coming into contact with a disease, for example, but you are actually guilty of Adam and Eve's sin. So the Protestant understanding, and when I say Protestant, I mean Lutheran, I mean Calvinists, such as the Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed, and even Anglicans, some Anglicans, not all, understand original sin to mean original guilt, that the sin of Adam and Eve, the guilt of Adam, is imputed to his progeny. And basically, this is why you even have some Calvinist teachers who say that a baby is born a sinner, is born guilty of Adam and Eve's sin. And this is why if you ever ask a Reformed pastor if he's being honest with himself, could a baby go to hell? He basically would have to say yes, because, and they say, well, why does a baby need to go to hell? What has a baby done? And they'll say, well, it's because sadly Adam's sin is imputed to him, and his guilt is imputed to him because he's as guilty of eating the fruit as Adam is. Well, when one understands original sin in this way, which I said is heretical, the logic is that if one is guilty of Adam's sin eons ago, one can easily be guilty of the sins of one's forebears only a few centuries ago, right? The Protestant churches, I have to say churches because there's not just one Protestant church, it's churches, there's thousands of them, are far more susceptible to heresies like critical race theory because of the inherent Protestant doctrines which make those thoughts possible in the first place. Now, you do have Catholics and Orthodox, some Catholics and some Orthodox people and other apostolic traditions who will adopt this critical race theory wokeness nonsense, but they have no reason to theologically. It just does not make sense in their theology. Whereas in Protestantism, it makes perfect sense. If you can be guilty of Adam and Eve's sin, which happened a long time ago, you can be guilty of your great granddaddy's sin. I mean, you know, when your granddaddy was a racist not so long ago, right? The idea of accepting critical race theory in Protestantism is much, much easier than it is in traditional apostolic Christianity. Another example of this, James White once said on his Dividing Line podcast, quote, "What struck me was there is, in a sense," oh boy, I'm going to get in trouble for this, "in many churches of whatever ethnic mix, there is an anti-intellectualism, an anti-church historyism, there is an anti-theologyism, there is an anti-Bible translation. Bible transmissionism, and it's seen in the fact that it's almost never addressed, but it's especially true in Black churches. It's just the reality. The idea of sound doctrine, church history, there are so few. Well, in response, Eric Mason, another one of the proponents of CRT being introduced into Reformed evangelicalism, and the author of a book called Woke Church, he said, many of the Black church preaching heroes aren't authors or have their preaching catalog made readily available, but it's too much out of their, I can't remember what that says, to be ignorant and make racist comments like this. Yes, this is racist. I happen to agree. I don't know how you could read James White's comments, especially as an Orthodox Christian like myself, and see how that is not racist. But there's something going on here that I'm sure that James White probably has knowledge of, but I think that maybe Eric Mason has no knowledge of. But let's move on. However, I came across an article called "Is Reformed Theology for Black People?" and it was written by Mr. Jamar Tisby here. And I wanted to share 2 quotes from that. It says, "One issue Black people have with Reformed theology is its Eurocentric roots. Reformed theology came to America by way of European countries, including France, England, Scotland, and the Netherlands. White educated men crafted the teachings, wrote the books, and led the churches. They did not have Black people in mind." Interesting. He also says, Black and brown people, among whom Christianity is growing exponentially in the majority of the world, must articulate the doctrines in a way that makes them relevant to present day. Women, as half the population and equal as God's image bearers, must have a vocal and visible role in this movement. White Christians must follow and learn from those whom society has often marginalized. Today's Reformation must be an inclusive one that makes room for both men, women, and men, of all economic classes and every tribe and tongue of those who believe. He makes, whether you agree with the article or the quotes here or not, he makes a valid point in that Reformed theology, for most of its 400 some odd year history, really has had next to no ethnic people of color, if you will, who were contributing theologians. He's absolutely right. It's very Eurocentric. The only one I can really even think of off the top of my head would be Samson Occam, who was a Puritan Native American preacher. But it's interesting, in his own writings, his own journals, he mentions being mistrusted by the Puritans due to the color of his skin. So even when somebody could rise up to be a pastor in a Puritan colony, educated and able to lead a church, he's still treated with this deep level of suspicion. So I think Jamar is hitting on something that's absolutely true. But we're going to come back to this in just a moment. So it's no secret that Calvinism in America, Reformed theology in America, was brought here by the Puritans when England exiled them from the motherland. And they brought with them many different ideas, postmillennialism being one of them. Postmillennialism is an eschatology which says that the millennial reign of Christ will not begin until an era of Christian prosperity at both the economic, governmental, and influential level of society is established. In other words, the world is going to get better, and Christians are going to inaugurate the kingdom of God. This also came with dominionism, and this is the idea that it is the right and duty of the church, meaning Calvinist church in this context, to inaugurate a Christian era of prosperity. Just said that. There's also this idea of New Israelism. This is the divine right and divine right and providence. This is tied to Calvin's ideas of predestination. So this is the idea that because Christians, it is the church's responsibility to usher in this era of Christian prosperity that, and not just monetarily, but we're talking societally, governmentally, etc., that it is the Christian's divine right to conquer and have dominion over non-Christian things, right? And many of the Puritans saw their colonies as being a new Israel, this idea of being a city on the hill, a shining example to all the world. Many of the Puritans felt it was their divine right to settle America, even if that meant taking it from the local Indians. And that because they were the elect people of God, that God had predestined them to take this land, and that it was their divine right to do so. These ideas would later give birth to other ideas which were divorced from Puritanism, but still maintain a very religious trappings. This would include American exceptionalism. This is the idea that America is a special, set-apart nation chosen by God, etc. We're not like everyone else idea. Manifest destiny. This comes from the idea of divine right. This is the idea that that spurred the expansion to the West. When this is the idea that because America has been given this divine mission, it is therefore her divine right to civilize and conquer the lands that belong to the Indians. And this, of course, led to the Plains Indian War. The prosperity gospel also came out of here because the Puritans, like many other Calvinists, believed that the elect would show marks of election. And this included prospering in your business and doing well, and that people who were non-elect would show marks of that, showing how, they would be not succeeding, not doing well, things like that, because this whole tie to the post-millennialist kind of thought of eschatology. If the church is supposed to be the people who inaugurate the second coming of Christ, they have to succeed at what they're doing, right? But this also led to the prolonging of American slavery and Jim Crow and later segregation all the way up until the 1960s with the civil rights movement. Just to give some examples of the heresy of the Puritans here, this is Governor John Winthrop. On a certain Sunday, he gave a sermon. Interesting that governors could give sermons. He said this: "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we become consumed out of the good land whither we are going." The Old Testament language and imagery that Governor Winthrop is using here is unmistakable. If you've read Deuteronomy, if you've read the Torah in general, you hear about these ideas that where God says, "I've set before you life and death, choose life that you may live." Well, essentially, Governor John Winthrop is calling a curse upon kind of a curse and a blessing upon the Puritan colonies. Like, if we serve God, may God bless us. If we don't, may he curse us. Very dangerous thing to do, because things like that are not empty, right? To call a curse upon yourself for not fulfilling what you believe is God's will is quite dangerous. And this also shows that he believed that the Puritan colonies were in the same covenant, or a very similar covenant with God that national Israel was. This is that idea of new Israelism coming out again. Very, very odd, but you're going to see how taking this point of view really reveals itself. So some of the folks who understood themselves as this new Israel, if you will, with a divine right to conquer and take the land, from the native Indians. Well, here's the thing. If the Puritan colonies are this new Israel, this new Jerusalem, then who are the Canaanites they have to drive out of the land? Well, naturally, it's the Native Americans. Well, one very famous or infamous Puritan preacher by the name of Reverend Increase Mather said this about the Native Americans that lived near his colony, that the heathen people amongst whom we live and whose land the Lord God of our fathers have given to us for rightful possession have sundry times been plotting mischievous devices against that part of the English Israel, which is seated in these goings down of the sun. No man that is an inhabitant of any considerable standing can be ignorant. Just what I said, right? His son, Reverend Cotton Mather, would follow in his footsteps, and he would say this: in a little more than 1 hour, he's recalling a battle in the Pequot War. In a little more than an hour, 500 or 600 of these barbarians were dismissed from a world that was burdened with them. Quite nice for a pastor to say, don't you think? William Bradford, another prominent Puritan, said this about the Pequot War: it was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stink, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave their praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, the English, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands and give them so speedily a victory over so proud and insulting of an enemy. This is quite a very gruesome picture. I couldn't actually fit everything into these slides, but there was another Puritan captain of the soldiers who had fought in this particular war with the Indians, and he talks about killing native women, men, and children indiscriminately. And he then says that, like, well, it may seem cruel that we kill these small children and women, but, you know, David did the same thing and Joshua did the same thing. So, you know, sometimes you got to do that. So he uses the Bible to justify essentially what amounts to genocide. And I think this is really where you see why, you know, when you understand that these are just people whom Joshua and David slaughtered. These are just normal people. I'm like, yeah, I guess you could justify that, but we know in the Orthodox Church that these people whom David and Joshua slaughtered and put to the sword along with their women and children were in fact giant clans. Anyway, different conversation, but go listen to Lord of Spirits. It's like I said, I can't do a Caleb's Corner without plugging the Lord of Spirits. So there you go. Go listen to Lord of Spirits and go listen to the episode called The Land of the Giants. But anyway, yeah, so this idea of that there are these chosen people and it's their divine right to conquer and take the land from the Native Americans and slaughter them if they resist, using the Bible to justify it, just horrible. Horrible. But let's keep going. The same attitude would later go on to and sort of transfer over to when the birth of what we would call evangelicalism occurred in the United States during the Great Awakening. And while guys like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, who you see here, were not so keen on the whole new Israelism, them being this, you know, city on a hill or whatever, right? Nonetheless, a lot of the same worldviews that the Puritans shared continued to affect their theology in such a way that it prolonged the practice of American slavery. Jonathan Edwards was known to be a slave owner, as was George Whitefield. This is what Jonathan Edwards had to say about slavery. God in his providence suffers some men to be enslaved. From the beginning, he intended that they should be enslaved and made them with this intention. Jonathan Edwards received quite a bit of criticism for owning slaves, as did George Whitefield. And it seems that he always drew back on the idea of providence or predestination justifying him owning slaves, that, well, God made some men to be slaves and made some men to be masters. I happen to be the master, they happen to be the slave. There's nothing I can do about it. But he also said this: it may be hoped that many of the Negroes and Indians will be divines, meaning teachers, Bible teachers, and that excellent books will be published in Africa and Ethiopia and Turkey, and not only very learned men, but others that are more ordinary men shall be knowing in religion. This is what I find the most ironic. I don't know if Jonathan Edwards just didn't know, or if he was just, I don't know. But there were already Christians in Africa and Ethiopia and Turkey, Orthodox Christians. I mean, honestly, if he had sent, Black and Indian Puritan preachers to these countries, they probably would have been laughed out of the country. And one of the things I was bringing up earlier when we were discussing Jemar Tisby and Eric Mason, how they talk about, that in the Black church that they, most people were not educated men, they were self-taught men and things of that nature. What I find really, really tragic about this is that they are cut off from their own history, because Africa and African theologians and African church fathers have had such a profound impact on the history of Christianity. And it just shows how ignorant that guys like Jemar Tisby and Eric Mason are, or maybe they're not ignorant of the fact that Orthodox Christianity has had a huge influence from Africa, and that some of our most prominent saints are in fact African. It could very well be that, like James White, they see Orthodoxy as heretical to what they understand as the gospel, and therefore, sadly, people like Eric Mason and Jemar Tisby are cut off from prominent African theologians whose thoughts have influenced the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. It's quite tragic. But it seems this thought process, this cutting off, was even going on in Jonathan Edwards' time period. George Whitefield was often confronted by, who was also a slave owner. He was actually, let me start over. George Whitefield was also a slave owner during the Great Awakening. He was confronted by a number of Quakers and others who were against the practice of slavery. And even John and Charles Wesley confronted him quite a bit about slavery. It's interesting that it was predominantly the Calvinist churches that were pro-slavery, and predominantly the Arminian churches that were prominently anti-slavery. But George Whitefield once said this in response to a letter he received from a Quaker. He said, quote, "As for the lawfulness of keeping slaves, I have no doubt, since I hear of some that were bought with Abraham's money and some that were born in his house. What a flourishing country might Georgia have been had the use of them been permitted years ago. How many white people have been destroyed for want of them? How many thousands of pounds spent on to no purpose at all? Though it is true that they are brought in a wrong way from their own country, and it is a trade not to be approved of, yet it is as it will be carried on whether we will or not. I should think myself highly favored if I could purchase a good number of them in order to make their lives comfortable and lay a foundation for breeding up their posterity in the nature and admonition of the Lord. I had no hand in bringing them into Georgia, though my judgment was for it, and I strongly importuned thereto. Yet I would not have a Negro upon my plantation till the use of them was publicly allowed by the colony. It was actually George Whitefield who campaigned for slavery to be made legal in Georgia." Yeah, and what's interesting is that though Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield both disagreed with the slave trade, which was just god-awful, they nonetheless were not opposed to the practice, and they often use this predestination language and God's providence to justify their use and practice of slavery in the American colonies. It was actually John Wesley who argued that because God has made man free and endowed with free will, that a man has no right to own another man. And what's interesting here is that the argument that John Wesley makes here was not even his own argument. It was an argument made by St. Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers, whom John Wesley was very familiar with. St. Gregory of Nyssa was an Eastern Church father from Cappadocia, Greece, which is where Turkey is today. Turkey was actually a Greek province at the time. But one of the earliest opponents and vocal opponents of slavery was St. Gregory of Nyssa, whom Charles and John Wesley's echoed in his arguments against slavery. So it's interesting how to see that Calvinist theology actually prolonged slavery, as we'll continue to see. This is Reverend Robert Louis Dabney. He was a Presbyterian pastor and one who wrote the autobiography for the brilliant Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. He once wrote this regarding slavery: once more, if society contains a class of adults, those of African descent, of adult members, those of African descent, so deficient in virtue and intelligence that they would only abuse the fuller privileges of other citizens to their own and others' detriment, it is just to withhold so many of these privileges and to impose so much restraint as it may be necessary for the highest equity of the whole body, inclusive of this subject class, and how much restraint is just must be determined by facts and experience. In other words, Dabney was not only pro-slavery, but he saw slavery as a good for restraining what he saw as inferior peoples. He believed that basically those of African descent were not smart enough and lacked the IQ to enjoy privileges with discipline in the way that a white person would, and that the white man was actually doing slaves a favor by enslaving them. And I didn't include it here, but I have an article written on this, which has a lot more detail than what you see in these slides here. So if you're interested in it, you can head over to my blog, which is Ordinary Orthodoxy, and the name of this article is called A Poison of a Different Kind. But Robert Louis Dabney actually also justifies slavery according to his understanding of Calvinistic predestination and providence. But this same attitude about needing to restrain certain peoples who are by nature barbaric and animalistic and base, the same attitude towards non-whites would also feed the American expansion westward, which would culminate in the Plains Wars that would bring about the exile, slaughter, and even imprisonment of Native Americans. It's interesting that the symbol that they chose for their move west was this Greco-Roman pagan goddess-like figure called Columba. And it's like, or Columbia. It's like, so spiritual forces are certainly at work in ways that we generally cannot imagine. But what I was getting at with this whole thing is that there are deep-seated racist theologies within Calvinism. All those guys I showed who are opponents of critical race theory are just love the Puritans. And supposedly those who are pro-critical race theory and Reformed evangelicalism these days also love the Puritans, but they love them with keeping them at an arm's length, regarding their beliefs about slavery and beliefs about non-whites and things of that nature. But the point I'm trying to point out here is that I believe that the proponents of critical race theory being integrated into Reformed evangelicalism realize that there is a deep-seated theological problem that has never been dealt with and rooted out of Reformed theology. And I think that the opponents of critical race theory in Reformed evangelicalism are right to realize that critical race theory is a Marxist anti-Christian ideology that does not need to be introduced into their churches. Nonetheless, what they're doing both is they're both trying to rescue Reformed theology. They're trying to rescue Calvinism and this legacy it has left behind, and trying to redeem the damage that America's Puritan past has done. But they're missing the point. They don't see the forest from the trees. Who you see here, this is Reverend Peter J. Lightheart from the Theopolis Institute. At the 6th annual Nevin Lectures on the Birmingham bombings in 2019, you can listen to these on YouTube, by the way. They're actually quite interesting. Reverend Lightheart constantly asks, where was the church? Where was the church? Where was the church? He's like, there's all these churches all around Birmingham. You know, where is the church? Where is the church? Where is the church? Right? And then he says, the church has a mission of unity to be the one church. The church is called to be a unified people, and this unity should be a visible unity. I agree. Because the churches were everywhere in Birmingham. The church as a visible unified body was nowhere. I somewhat agree. To his question, where was the church? I would have to say it was nowhere in Birmingham, at the very least. As far as what the church's duty is, I agree. It needs to be a single unified people, and that should be a visible unity. He says the churches were everywhere, meaning Protestant churches that are all different: Methodist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Baptist, Dutch Reformed, Episcopal, what have you. The church as a visible unified body was nowhere. Yeah, that's because Protestant churches aren't united. Even if we were just to take those 5 churches, Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Dutch Reformed, Anglican, even within those 5 distinctions, there are separated denominations. There are like 5 different denominations of Anglican. There are like 5 different denominations of Lutheran, 5 different denominations of Presbyterian, etc. I'm really generalizing here, but I think you get the point. There is no visible unified body anywhere in these Protestant churches. And it's funny because I think Peter Lightheart especially understands that there needs to be a Catholicity in the church, but unfortunately, Protestantism continues to fragment and schism, with a total of 40,000 Protestant denominations today, with an average on 2 new denominations being registered a week in America alone. Now you think, oh, 40,000, Caleb, that's really, come on, it can't be that many. Actually, it can be. Let me just give you a perfect example. The Southern Baptist Convention is not a denomination. It's basically a big, giant umbrella organization that is a gathering of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of independent Baptist churches. What have these Baptist churches got in common? Well, really nothing much. There's no presbytery hierarchy. There's no president over those certain things. I mean, yeah, the SBC elects a president, but it doesn't really mean much. And none of these statements they really sign or declare really have any sort of binding power. I mean, you've got your stodgy old fundamentalist Baptists, you've got your Reformed Baptists like James White and Jeff Durbin and others like that. You've got your kind of somewhat Reformed Baptists like John MacArthur and Russell Moore and others like that. You've got your non-denominational churches in the SBC that don't like the word Baptist, even though they are Baptists, that are charismatics. They have virtually nothing in common. These churches alone in the SBC, each church is a registered denomination. Each one. So yeah, I mean, honestly, with the 40,000 denominations I spoke about earlier, a huge chunk of them comes out of the Southern Baptist Convention. And we haven't even gotten to the Lutherans, Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Dutch Reformed. So yeah, it's very much true. But the point is, I think Peter Leithart knows the answer to this. What's the answer to true Catholicity? But the problem is he doesn't want to leave Protestantism. But Protestantism simply doesn't have it. So what is the Orthodox Church's answer to this wokeness to both sides? Well, I'm going to introduce some saints here. This is St. Peter. You know him, the apostle. St. Simon of Cyrene, the man who carried the cross of Jesus Christ, who would later become a bishop of the church, travel with Paul, and die a bishop of the church in France by crucifixion. This is St. Cuthbert of England, one of the Western saints that we have on our calendar. St. Isaac the Syrian, St. Mary of Egypt, St. John of Damascus, St. Peter the Aleut, a Native American saint, and St. Mitropen Yang. In the Orthodox Church, we always have the saints before our eyes in every parish we visit, in every parish we go to receive the precious body and blood of the Lord. And we see not just people who look like us, but people who look very different from us. On our church calendars, we have feast days for all of these people. And we're constantly remembering our brothers and sisters who are not part of our geographic region and are not part of our cultural experience and not part of our ethnicity. Yet all of these people are honored equally. Their icons are sensed and venerated just as anyone else would be. The Orthodox Church has always understood herself as a church for all tribes, tongues, and nations, and she has put her proverbial money where her proverbial mouth is concerning putting that into practice. Okay. Our first answer would be to Calvinism and Puritanism in general. It was condemned as a heresy in both the Confession of Dositheus and the Council of Jerusalem in 1672. I'll just share one answer. It says, as it is obvious, the church of the heretics, meaning Calvinists as well as Lutherans, undoubtedly is, and especially that of Calvin, who are not ashamed to learn from the church and then to wickedly repudiate her. Where do we stand on Calvinism? It's condemned as a heresy, as is Arminian, as is Arianism, as is Monophysitism, as is Gnosticism and Islam and all those other kinds of heresies. The Council of Constantinople in Article 1 in the year 1872 said, we censure, condemn, and declare contrary to the teachings of the gospel and the sacred canons of the Holy Fathers the doctrine of philitism, or the differences of races and national diversity in the bosom of the Church of Christ. Philitism is the practice where if you're a Greek church, your leadership is only Greek. If you're an African church, your leadership is only African. It's basically Jim Crow segregation in a church. The Orthodox Church has had problems with this, and because of problems with that, in 1872, a formal declaration was made by the patriarchs that this is a heresy. But we never had to deal with it up until then. Before then, we had always had African saints, Asian saints, English saints, Greek saints, Syrian, Arabic saints, Egyptian saints, you name it, right? And in that slide I had earlier with the icons of the various saints from around the world, this is what I mean. It's such a tragedy that someone like Jamar Tisby and Eric Mason are cut off from people like St. Simon of Cyrene. It's just one example of an African saint. I haven't even talked about St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Athanasius, St. Mary of Egypt, St. Moses the Black, St. Cyprian of Carthage. I mean, just Tertullian, even just mountains upon mountains of African saints who have contributed widely to the church, meaning the Eastern Orthodox Church. Because they bought into this Reformed theology, they will not have any of the rich history from their own people who have made significant contributions to the church that are used by all Christians around the world in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's people like James White and others who are leading the Reformed movement today that have said, oh, that orthodoxy is a heresy and things of that nature. And unfortunately, this keeps our brothers who would probably thrive in the Orthodox Church from coming to the Orthodox Church. It's tragic. But to sum this all up, the Reformed evangelical world has two warring factions, but neither can see the proverbial forest from the trees. The critical race theory proponents believe that implementing critical race theory will correct the racial segregation problem within their communions, as we saw from the Puritans to the Great Awakening to American slavery and up until the Civil Rights Movement. The Protestant churches continue to naturally segregate. But this is a woefully deceived mistake. Critical race theory opponents believe that there is nothing wrong with their communions, and there's therefore nothing to correct as they currently are. But as we said, this is simply not true. Calvinism is a heresy in and of itself. Puritanism is a heresy in and of itself. But there are some things which it does get right in basic theology. But the problem is that when you allow something this nasty and this wicked and this heretical to go on, when you deal with something like this, you have to replace it with something else. You can't just sweep the house and then not fill it, as Jesus talked about. Whenever you cast a demon out, you have to fill the house, otherwise the demon goes and gets 7 more spirits wicked than itself. And that's what I think is kind of going on theologically with the Reformed evangelical world, is that they thought they dealt with the racial problem, but now it's come back with a vengeance. And the problem is you can't correct heresy with more heresy. It just doesn't work that way. The heresy of the Puritans has never been properly dealt with. Their post-millennial eschatology and Calvinist soteriology and its resulting ideas are the doctrine of demons. It's 1 Timothy 4:1 would say. Until both parties surrender their heresy and likewise their admiration of the Puritans and come home to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, they will continue to divide by race. This is a great evangelistic opportunity for the Orthodox Church, so we should capitalize on it. So all this to say that Orthodox Christians have an opportunity now to reach out to the Black community and Hispanic community and all the other non-white communities who are feeling abandoned and disenfranchised by the Reformed and evangelical world. We do not have to placate to people's skin color. We do not have to do as these proponents of critical race theories are doing in the Reformed evangelical world. We simply have to be the church. We have so much history regarding the saints from all around the world, showing that the Lord Jesus Christ is building his kingdom with people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. I would love to see Jamar Tisby become an Orthodox Christian. I would love for Eric Mason to become an Orthodox Christian. And I think now is the time better than ever to do this. It's, I think that I just couldn't imagine being told, if I'm trying just to put myself in the shoes of Black folks here, but, when you're told that, you're raised Christian, you found out that the way your ancestors found out about Christianity was through their slave masters. That puts you in a very unsettling frame of mind. But what if you were able to know that it was actually a Black African man who carried the cross of Jesus Christ, who became a missionary and a bishop of the church under Paul. And that same man's sons, Rufus and Alexander, became zealous missionaries and martyrs, and that some of the most prominent theologians in all of the church's history were in fact African people. That would change your outlook about a lot of things. I think the Orthodox Church just has so much to offer. And I think that as people are continuing to fall away from the Reformed evangelical, Calvinistic, young, restless, and Reformed world, that we need to be there waiting, not as vultures waiting for an opportunity, but as brothers and sisters with our arms open saying, come home. So anyway, that's it for Caleb's Corner. I hope that was insightful. Would love to hear your thoughts. If you ever want to message me, you can find me on Facebook. You can always hit up Kevin. Always check out our page, Freed Indeed Ministries, if you ever want to see more content like this. So please share this with your family and friends so that they too may be freed indeed. Thank you and have a good night.